The Zaurathan overseers stood in a half-circle, their chitinous limbs folded, mandibles twitching with amusement. Their dull green exoskeletons shimmered under the cold artificial lights of the labor camp as they watched the humans struggle with their assigned tasks. To them, Earth was nothing more than a broken world, its people crushed beneath the weight of superior technology. The prisoners, mostly former soldiers, engineers, and workers, were kept alive only because they were useful. For now, Sergeant Jack Calloway knelt beside a rusted crate, his weather hands tightening the straps on a tarp. His body ached from days of forced labor, but his mind remained sharp. He had survived too much war's orbital bombardments, the fall of his country, to let some bug-eyed conquerors break him. Nearby, Mac Donovan wiped sweat from his face with a grease-stained sleeve, his sharp eyes darting between their captors and the workstations. The former Army engineer had spent the last few weeks studying their surroundings, memorizing every weakness. The Zaurathan commander, Rilvok, chittered something to his subordinates, then turned his glowing yellow eyes toward the prisoners. "You creatures," he said, voice crackling through a crude translation device. "Your primitive weapons were laughable, incapable of penetrating even our weakest armor. I almost pity your ignorance." Hawk Hawkins, a former Navy SEAL sniper, leaned against a stack of scrap metal, his arms crossed. His expression was unreadable, but Calloway saw the same fire in his eyes that had carried them through Earth's last desperate stand. Across the yard, Gunnery Sergeant Rabe Deuce Harris worked on a disassembled drone, pretending to ignore the aliens' taunts. But Calloway knew better. Deuce had a temper, and he was biting down on it hard. The Zaurathans had made the mistake of letting their prisoners scavenge the remains of Earth's weapons, perhaps as a cruel joke. A few months ago, one of their higher-ups had proposed a demonstration to mock human technology, an opportunity for the prisoners to show what they had left, to humiliate themselves before their masters. Calloway had nodded along, hiding his smirk. And so, today, in the dusty remains of a former U.S. military outpost, a group of battered yet unbroken men stood beside their chosen artifact, a Browning M2.50 caliber machine gun. The weapon was old, but not fragile. It had survived wars before humanity even reached the stars, and it was ready to fight again. Rilvok motioned lazily toward one of the hovering drones at his side. "Since you insist on clinging to your primitive past, we shall indulge you. This machine is equipped with standard Zaurathan combat shielding. It renders all projectile weaponry useless. Fire your toy, and we will watch your hopes shatter against progress." Calloway glanced at Mac, who gave him the smallest of nods. They had tested this in secret with whatever scraps they could find. Kinetic energy weapons, as outdated as they were, operated on simple physics. The Zaurathan shields deflected energy-based attacks, but were practically useless against sheer brute force. The Empire had spent centuries fighting plasma, lasers, and railgun bursts, never once considering that something as simple as a high-caliber bullet could ruin their day. Calloway stepped forward, placing a calloused hand on the machine gun's grip. He took his time, feeding the belt of ammunition through, feeling the weight of history settle over him. The Zaurathans watched with amusement. The other prisoners stood tense, waiting. "Fire when ready, human," Rilvok mocked. Calloway squeezed the trigger. The M2 roared to life, its heavy thudding echoing across the camp. The first round punched forward at supersonic speed. The drone's shield flared, a shimmering blue ripple in the air, but it lasted less than a heartbeat. The .50 caliber round tore through it like paper and continued, slamming into the drone's sleek, insectoid frame. Sparks exploded from the impact point. The machine wobbled. The second round followed a fraction of a second later. then a third, then a fourth. The Zaurathans stopped laughing. The drone's structure gave way, its core rupturing in a violent detonation. A smoking, shattered husk crashed into the ground. For a long, perfect moment, the labor camp was silent. Then, Deuce let out a slow whistle. Would you look at that? Rilvok took a step back. His mandibles twitched in confusion, his underlings shifting uneasily. Calloway could see their thoughts forming. The calculations, the disbelief. This wasn't possible. The Empire had conquered 100 worlds. No species had ever defied their shielding. And yet, here stood a battered old machine gun, the very definition of outdated human warfare, still smoldering from a single burst of fire. Mac clapped a hand on the gun's frame, his grin barely restrained. Guess physics is still on our side. Hawk exhaled through his nose, adjusting his stance. Now, what boss? Calloway didn't hesitate. The aliens were stunned, their arrogance shattered for the first time since their arrival. This was the moment. He reached down, grabbed the sidearm from the holster of the nearest Zaurathan guard, and pulled the trigger. The plasma bolt caught the alien in the throat, sending him sprawling with a guttural hiss. Chaos erupted. Deuce tackled another guard, wrenching a rifle from his clawed grip and turning it back on the others. Hawk dropped low, grabbed a knife from a fallen alien, and drove it through an exposed joint. Mac, always the fastest thinker, sprinted for the supply crates, searching for anything that could be turned into an advantage. Calloway swung the M2 around and squeezed the trigger again. The air filled with the deafening roar of gunfire as rounds tore through armor and exoskeleton alike. The Empire had come expecting submission. They had come believing in their invincibility. But today they had learned something else. They had learned what happened when you underestimated an American with a machine gun. The desert swallowed them. Calloway crouched low in the dried-out riverbed, rifle pressed tight against his shoulder. The others fanned out behind him, moving carefully between the broken rocks and brittle brush. Above them, a Zaurathan scout drone skimmed the sky, its metallic frame reflecting the pale light of a crescent moon. They had escaped a labor camp 2 nights ago, leaving behind a trail of smoldering wreckage and dead overseers. But the Zaurathans were hunting them now, and their fury was growing. Mac knelt beside him, adjusting the makeshift sling on his stolen rifle. His face was streaked with dust and sweat, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. They'll be sweeping the area by dawn. We need to keep moving. Calloway nodded, scanning the terrain ahead. A few miles to the west, buried beneath the shifting sands, lay an old military installation, one of the last places on Earth where American steel still rested, waiting to be found. Behind them, Deuce helped Hawk lay down one of the injured prisoners they had taken with them from the camp. The man groaned, his leg wrapped in strips of torn fabric. "Damn bug shot me good," he muttered through clenched teeth. "You'll live," Hawk said, tightening the bandage. "Just don't expect to run a marathon." The ground trembled slightly, a distant hum, growing stronger. Calloway didn't need to see the source to know what it was. Zaurathan patrol craft, hunting for them in the darkness. "Move," he said. They covered the last few miles quickly, using the terrain for cover, every breath filled with the scent of dust and sweat. Finally, Mac found the entrance, buried beneath a collapsed section of rock. He and Deuce worked quickly, clearing the rubble until they reached a rusted hatch. "Moment of truth," Mac muttered, prying it open with a crowbar. The metal groaned but gave way, revealing a narrow tunnel that plunged into darkness. Calloway waved them inside. "Go." One by one, they climbed down into the forgotten base, leaving the surface behind. The air was stale, thick with the scent of oil and rust. Emergency lights flickered dimly, painting the walls in eerie shades of orange and red. Mac let out a low whistle. Welcome home. The base had been abandoned for years, left to rot when the war against the Zaurathans became hopeless, but was still intact. Its halls lined with crates of equipment, its armories untouched by alien hands. Calloway ran a hand along the cold steel of a workbench. Start searching. We need weapons, vehicles, anything that still works. Deuce didn't need to be told twice. He was already cracking open storage lockers, pulling out rifles, grenades, and belts of ammunition. Damn, this is a gold mine. Mac found an old computer terminal and went to work, his fingers flying over the keys. If the power grid is still functional, I might be able to get the security systems online. Maybe even access some old schematics. Hawk stood near the entrance, keeping watch. We don't have long. Those patrols are getting closer. Calloway grabbed a rifle from a pile and checked the magazine. Then let's make it count. They worked through the night, scavenging everything they could. Deuce discovered a stockpile of explosives, enough to take out a Zaurathan dropship if placed correctly. Hawk found a cache of sniper rifles, their scopes still intact. But it was Mac who made the biggest discovery. Boss, he called, waving Calloway over. You're going to want to see this. Calloway joined him at the far end of the storage bay, where a massive tarp covered something large. Mac grabbed a handful of fabric and yanked it away, revealing the hulking shape beneath. A tank. Not just any tank. An M1A2 Abrams, its armor thick, its treads caked with dust, but still intact. Calloway ran a hand over its hull, feeling the cold metal beneath his fingers. Does it run? Mac grinned. Only one way to find out. It took an hour of work, but when Mac finally climbed into the driver's seat and hit the ignition, the engine rumbled to life. The sound filled the chamber, deep and powerful. Deuce let out a bark of laughter. Now we're talking. Calloway climbed onto the turret, gripping the mounted M2 Browning, the same gun that had torn through the Zaurathan drone days before. He took a deep breath, letting the weight of the moment settle over him. The war wasn't over. Not yet. And for the first time since the invasion, they had the means to fight back. The desert stretched wide and empty, but the Americans knew how to use the terrain. Calloway crouched low behind a ridge, binoculars pressed to his eyes as he surveyed the Zaurathan supply convoy crawling across the valley floor. 6 armor transports, flanked by 2-legged walker drones and a pair of skimmer escorts, their engines emitting a dull, electric hum. Each one carried weapons, energy cores, and rations bound for a heavily fortified outpost to the north. If the resistance was going to survive, they needed those supplies more than the enemy did. Mac lay beside him, tapping a pencil against his stolen data pad. They're running in tight formation. Must think they're untouchable. Deuce adjusted the grip on his rifle, checking the magazine with practiced ease. They ain't. Hawk, positioned farther down the ridge, peered through his scope. 2 drivers per transport, 1 gunner up top. Skimmers will be a problem if they get airborne. Calloway exhaled slowly. They had planned for this. The Abrams was waiting, buried beneath a tarp a few miles back. The Humvees were ready, reinforced with scavenged plating and modified to carry heavier weapons. The men were armed, each carrying a mix of captured Zaurathan plasma rifles and reliable American steel. It wasn't much against the full might of the Empire, but against a supply convoy, it was more than enough. He lowered the binoculars. We hit them hard, hit them fast. Mac, get those EMP charges in place. Hawk, pick your targets. Deuce, you're with me on the Humvee. Let's introduce these bastards to old-fashioned American ingenuity. Mac grinned, already moving. Hawk disappeared into the brush, vanishing like a ghost. Deuce clapped his hands together. Been too damn long since I blew something up. They spread out, maneuvering into position. Mac and two others slithered down the ridge, planting EMP charges along the convoy's path. Hawk took position atop an outcropping, his rifle nestled against his shoulder. Calloway and Deuce returned to the vehicles, where the rest of the resistance fighters waited. The minutes dragged. The convoy rolled forward, oblivious. Then, a sharp crack rang out. Hawk's rifle spoke first, and the lead driver slumped forward, his alien body jerking violently. The vehicle veered, crashing into a rock formation. Before the others could react, the EMP charges detonated. Blue-white arcs of energy erupted along the road, frying circuits and sending Walker drones sprawling. The skimmers bucked midair, their stabilizers flickering. Calloway gunned the Humvee's engine, roaring forward with Deuce in the turret. The M2 Browning thundered, spitting a stream of rounds that shredded through the nearest transport's armor. The Zaurathans inside barely had time to scream before the vehicle exploded in a fireball. The Abrams roared to life behind them. Its treads crushed the earth, its turret rotating with lethal precision. Mac, operating the cannon, lined up a shot. A moment later, the nearest skimmer ceased to exist, torn apart in a flash of steel and fire. The Zaurathans scrambled to respond. Surviving infantry poured from the damaged transports, their rifles spitting blue bolts of plasma. A few rounds struck the Humvee, sizzling against the reinforced plating. Calloway jerked the wheel, weaving through the chaos as Deuce kept firing. Hawk picked them off one by one. Mac lined up another shot. The last skimmer tried to escape, its pilot desperately yanking the controls. Calloway saw it coming. He swerved the Humvee, bracing himself. Deuce didn't need to be told. He swung the turret, leading his target, and fired. The .50 caliber rounds punched through the skimmer's engines. It spiraled, a wounded beast, crashing into the dirt in a spectacular eruption of debris. The battle was over in minutes. Smoke curled into the sky. The Zaurathans lay dead or dying. The few survivors, wounded and dazed, were rounded up and stripped of weapons. Calloway stepped over the wreckage, his boots crunching against alien metal. The supplies were theirs. The resistance had won this round. But the war was far from over. The wind carried the acrid scent of burning metal across the desert. The convoy lay in ruins. Shattered Zaurathan vehicles scattered across the sand like broken shells. Calloway watched as Mac and the others worked quickly, loading stolen crates of ammunition and rations onto their salvage transports. The mission had been a success, but they didn't have time to celebrate. A low vibration rumbled through the ground beneath Calloway's boots. Not thunder, not distant artillery. Something worse. Deuce turned from the wreckage of a Walker drone, his expression grim. We got incoming. Hawk was already scanning the horizon through his scope. 2 dropships. Heavy escorts. They're bringing the hammer down. Calloway felt his pulse steady. This had always been a possibility. The Zaurathans weren't used to losing. They had assumed humanity was broken, scattered, incapable of real resistance. Tonight had changed that. Now, the Empire would respond the only way it knew how, overwhelming force. He turned to Mac. How long until we're ready to roll? Mac wiped sweat from his brow, glancing at the half-loaded vehicles. 10 minutes. We don't have 10. Calloway looked to the Abrams, still idling in the wreckage. A plan was already forming in his mind, A desperate one, but the only one that gave them a chance. Hawk followed his gaze. "You're thinking suicide run." "Not suicide," Calloway said. "Just a distraction." Deuce cracked his knuckles. "Hell, I'm in." Mac hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "We pull this off. We buy the Resistance real time." Calloway climbed onto the tank, gripping the edge of the turret. "Then let's get loud." The Abrams rolled forward, crushing debris beneath its treads. Calloway took position at the mounted M2, its barrel still hot from the last fight. Deuce loaded up inside, prepping the main gun. Mac rode in the second Humvee, leading the rest of the convoy away toward the mountains. The Zaurathan dropships screamed closer, their sleek black forms blotting out the stars. Their weapons charged, plasma turrets swiveling toward the wreckage. They thought they were about to wipe out the last of the rebels. They didn't realize the rebels had already made their move. Calloway braced himself as the first dropship opened fire. Plasma bolts rained down, exploding against the sand, turning patches of earth into molten glass. Deuce roared over the comms, sending them a welcome gift. The tank's main gun fired, the shell streaking toward the closest dropship. It struck dead center, rupturing the hull with a concussive blast. The craft veered sideways, belching smoke. Calloway swung the Browning around, hammering the escort drones as they swarmed in. The heavy rounds shredded through their armor, sending them spiraling out of the sky. But there were too many. The second dropship was still fully operational, and its guns turned toward them with surgical precision. A direct hit sent the Abrams skidding. Calloway gritted his teeth, holding on to the turret as the tank barely held together. "Gonna be real hard to walk away from this one," Deuce muttered. "Not the plan," Calloway said. "We hold as long as we can. Make sure they only see us, not the convoy." The Humvee exploded in the distance, one of the other vehicles taken out mid-retreat. Mac's voice came through the radio, strained. "We're almost clear. Just a little longer." Calloway fired until the M2 ran dry. The last drone fell, but the dropship loomed above them, its weapons charging for the kill shot. Then, from the distant ridge, a sudden flash. A missile streaked through the sky. It struck the dropship with brutal precision, piercing its reactor core. The explosion lit up the night, a miniature sun burning in the heavens. The shock waves slammed into the Abrams, rattling the frame. Calloway shielded his eyes as debris rained down. When the fireball faded, the sky was empty. No more enemy craft. A voice crackled over the radio. "Figured you boys could use a hand." Mac laughed, breathless. Damn good timing. The convoy was gone, safe in the mountains. Calloway exhaled, feeling the weight lift. The Empire had sent its best, and it hadn't been enough. This was no longer a war of survival. It was a war they could win.